So we'll dive right in. So we'll be talking today about silence in Aaron Zeitlin's post-Holocaust poetry. How does he present silence, and how does that presentation interact with both modern literary theory and also with traditional Jewish sources? So first, just a little bit of a biography. So Aaron Zeitlin is the son of Hillel Zeitlin, an important Jewish mystic and writer. You can see Zeitlin father on the left in this photo and Zeitlin son on the right. Um, so he had many of his formative years in Warsaw, and then in 1939 spent what he thought would be some brief time in New York. But of course, while he was in New York, the war broke out, um, and by the end of the war, he was his family's sole survivor. And he wrote in a number of different genres in both Yiddish and Hebrew, although he's really best known as a Yiddish writer. Um, so with that in mind, oh, and yeah, so my hope is that this will whet your appetite if you're a Yiddish reader for more of his poetry. So the sources for these poems comes from his two-volume collected poems published in New York in 1967. But I want to introduce here a little bit of the literary theory that we'll be sort of talking about and in some ways against. So George Steiner writes, one of the consequences of the Shoah or Holocaust is to have transported violently, irreparably into Judaism, both religious and secular, the hermeneutic dilemma, the problem as to whether there is a human form of language adequate to conceptualize an understanding of Auschwitz, as to whether the limits of language do not fall short of the limits of the Shoah experience, is now ineradicably installed in Jewish existence. So let's see how this idea does and doesn't fit into Aaron Zeitlin's poetry, right? This idea that there's this new unspeakability. So if we look at this poem from 1945, Israel's Ashes, we see a version of this that kind of aligns, I think, with what Steiner is suggesting. So Zeitlin writes, if Jeremiah should now sit on Israel's ashes, he would not keen lamentations nor wash the ruins with tears. Even God himself could not open the well of God's own tears. Together with the millions of that burnt people, he would be silent, the most secret silence. Now even a scream is lying, even tears are just literature, even prayers lie. So we see in this poem, I think, the idea that something new has happened. The Holocaust is a new and newly ineffable catastrophe for Jewish history, such that all of the previous literary responses Jews have had to disaster are inadequate. Even Jeremiah, the great canonical poet of Jewish suffering and tragedy, has no choice but to be silent. But if we look at a later poem of Zeitlin's, we find, I think, a very different approach to post-Holocaust language and its discontinuity with canonical Jewish responses to catastrophe. I'm not sure exactly what year this poem is from, but it's called Where Were You? As you see, and it takes as its opening this question that God asks Job, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Of course, in the book of Job, Job responds to catastrophe by addressing God in very beautiful poetry, and God responds with a poetic theophany that has the effect of silencing Job. But Zeitlin's poem goes, from the tempest he asked Job, where were you when I made Leviathan, called on choirs of young stars to sing, opened worlds, sealed abysses? You know nothing. You cannot accuse me. Job hung his head and was silent. But now God is silent. A Jew accuses him. Where wast thou? Where were you when the German threw me in the gas chambers, burned me in his ovens, made soap from my body to clean his cane-like hands, rendered humanity impure forever, toxified your whole holy creation like a toilet? God is silent. A Jew accuses him. Where were you? What we see here is an inversion of what happens in the book of Job. There, Job is silent in response to God's speech. Here, God is silent, and God's silence enables human speech. What I think we find is that in this poem, just as Steiner says, a discontinuity does exist between pre and post Holocaust language, but counter to Steiner, this discontinuity is not defined by a new human silence, but the opposite, a new human capacity for speech, a capacity enabled precisely by the unprecedented extent of the catastrophe and the divine silence that that catastrophe demands. So this is a very different claim than we saw in the earlier poem of Zeitlin's. There, a canonical biblical poet rejects language and embraces silence. But here, a canonical biblical poet, Job, rejects silence and embraces speech, or a kind of Job stand-in. So we see clearly from this, I think, that the relationship between speech and silence demanded by the Holocaust is much more complicated than the linear movement from speech to silence that is often theorized. And these theories are often based on the idea that silence is a failure. So this is another quote from Steiner. He writes in one kind of silence, language simply ceases, and the motion of spirit gives no further outward manifestation of its being. Here, the word borders not on radiance or music, but on night. But what if silence is not this absence, this cessation, but actually can border on divine radiance, on revelation? I want to look briefly at three Jewish sources that I think speak to this and offer a different way of theorizing silence. So the first one comes from the Torah. There's a kind of harrowing moment in the book of Leviticus when the biblical priest Aaron's sons are killed violently. Don't need to go into the details there for our purposes. But what ensues is a kind of haunting moment of silence. So Moses says to Aaron, "This is what God meant by saying, 'Through those near to me I show myself holy and gain glory before all the people.' And Aaron was silent." And Rashi, the most important medieval commentator, he comments on this verse, "Aaron received a reward for his silence. And what was the reward he received? That the subsequent divine address was made to him alone." So here, Aaron's silence isn't just an absence, it's a response to catastrophe, to grief, that enables and maybe even demands a unique new divine revelation. The next two sources I want to look at are from Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav. Rabbi Nachman was born in 1772, died in 1810. He was an important Ukrainian Jewish mystic. And like many of his teachings, these are very complicated and convoluted and technically Kabbalistic. So we'll just kind of give them a cursory paraphrase. But in this one selection from his Likutei Moharan, he writes that the rectification for being humiliated and having one's blood spilled is to turn from dam, Hebrew for blood, to dom, quiet, silence, stillness. He should be among those who hear themselves ridiculed and yet do not retort. Nor should he be vexed by affronts to his honor, for when he fulfills "be quiet for God," then the Holy One strikes his enemies dead. So this is in the context of a much bigger Kabbalistic argument, but what Rabbi Nachman is saying here is that to be quiet in response to one's persecutors, has the effect of causing God to kill those persecutors. He's quite explicit about this, actually. So quiet for Rabbi Nachman here is paradoxically a form of agency, of violent agency. And another passage from Rabbi Nachman. So he's commenting on a Talmudic passage in which Moses sees into the future. He sees Rabbi Akiva being tortured. Moses says, "Is this the Torah and this its reward?" And God responds, "Be silent. Thus it has arisen in my thought." Rabbi Nachman says, thought is very exalted, and someone who wants to enter the world of thought must remain silent. This is the aspect of be silent. This is the way it has be silent. This is the way it has arisen in thought. To ascend to thought, one must be silent. Thought here is the divine thought, supernal thought. So for Rabbi Nachman, it's only through profound silence, the profound silence that only Moses can attain, that a human mind can be joined to the mind of divinity. It's worth noting that Rabbi Nachman was very, very important to Aaron Zeitlin. Zeitlin felt a kinship to him for a number of reasons. And what I want to suggest is that some version of these understandings of silence all features significantly in Zeitlin's poetry, much more so than the understanding of silence presented by Steiner and others. Silence not as absence, but as a paradoxical presence with tremendous transformative power. So we'll look at this poem. This is actually an excerpt from a longer poem by Zeitlin, After Victory. He wrote this you can see the date here. This is the day after that famous photo of the sailor kissing the nurse in Times Square is taken. So this is a time of national kind of jubilance in the United States that there's a victorious end to the war. And Zeitlin writes, joy is in the streets, thundering victory. From gases that choked my nation comes silence. The war is done. And Jews, 6 million Jews are done. No, not done. Now begins their silence. A new world war begins. The war of silence, the war of 6 million. You last silence, silence of the abyss, erupt with such power stronger than atomic bombs that you explode over the earth and its inhabitants. Shatter worlds, surge over worlds, collect your debt from heavens and abysses, silence of 6 million, world war of 6 million. Maybe you can hear that my dog was moved by this poem in the background. I apologize for that. But regardless, what I think we see here is a vision of silence, not as an absence, but as a powerful presence. Silence, not just as an emptiness, but also paradoxically, just like we see from Rabbi Nachman, as an emptiness that can demand restitution, reparation, and that really has tremendous power. So what we see in these poems, I think, is a very different way of understanding and relating to silence than Holocaust literary studies typically involves. It's very counter to Steiner's framing of silence as a cessation of expression in response to a new crisis of unspeakability. It's counter to theories that silence must be overcome. I think Sandra Gilman and others, say that Holocaust literature must register silence in order to move past it. Here we see that silence is a being in itself, something that has power and agency and both creative and destructive potential. And so I guess I want to just kind of close with this question. How would it change our relationship to Holocaust literature in general if instead of these theories that see silence as an absence or a failure, we see silence in this kind of Jewish mystical lineage of something that is a powerful and creative condition in itself? Thank you.